When I first started studying the law, people would say to me, "So what did you study first then?" And I'd tell them, we started on Roman law. And they always look at me funny and they say, "Roman law? Not something useful then?" But they were far, far mistaken. History is the precedent for everything. And English common law is made up of precedent. The way I got into the law was through a man who I'd heard about at school called Marcus Tullius Cicero. Now, Cicero was an ancient Roman orator. In fact, he was the greatest of the ancient Roman orators. And what an orator is a public speaker. Now, Cicero was also a great thinker, a great writer, a politician, and a statesman. But what attracted me most was the stories of him speaking in the great Roman Forum, defending justice, defending liberty, and defending the Roman Republic. Think of the Forum as a place much like the market square of today's towns, where people would talk about law, politics, social affairs, all in front of the passing crowd of citizens who may or may not be interested in what they were saying. Now, if you've ever given a speech in front of other people, you'll know it's no easy matter. It's not just about what you say, but how you say it and what you look like when you're saying it. The Forum must have been quite a nerve-wracking place for novice public speakers. This weekend, I have to give a public speech at my sister's wedding, which I suppose I should probably be rehearsing right now, rather than doing this. But there we are. Anyway, all the difficulties of public speaking, especially in the Roman Forum, which was the most sophisticated place in the Western world at that time, would have made it quite difficult for a man of an obscure background like Cicero to rise as high as he did. He was actually what the Romans called a novus homo, which literally translates as a new man. It's a bit like what we would sometimes pompously call people nowadays nouveau riche or new money, as opposed to the old money people who have inherited their wealth and haven't had to make it themselves. New men like Cicero came from modest means, unknown families, and they therefore had a point to prove by becoming famous in their own right. In Cicero's case, he had relatively few political connections before he came to Rome, and he had to use his voice to make his own way, which he did with great success. Cicero worked his way through the Roman political ranks, becoming a defender of republican values both in and out of court. His most famous speeches include prosecution of a corrupt governor who was exploiting the citizens of his province, or exposing the conspiracy of a Roman politician against the Roman state itself. He even stood up to Julius Caesar, defending justice and law against tyranny and aggression. Now, as if being a great public speaker was not enough, Cicero was also a prolific thinker and writer, and he wasn't alone. Rome was so sophisticated at the time of Cicero that they encountered many problems that we actually associate with the modern day. International shipping, trade, insurance, taxation, or citizenship, all of which are very complex problems, were already being grappled with by the Romans about 2,000 years or so ago. This means that the Romans are quite a good place to start if you're you're beginning your journey into law. The Roman state was also pretty stable. Rulers came and went, but generally there was no real threat of invasion for most of the time. This meant that clever men could spend all of their time thinking, writing, and discussing the law rather than having to defend their homes against invaders, for instance. This generally makes for high quality writing, which explains why much of it has stayed intact throughout the centuries. And that's an added bonus because it means there's plenty that we can learn from. Now, I could talk for absolutely hours about Roman law and the Romans themselves, but I'll restrict myself to just 3 main reasons why Roman law is worth learning and why the Romans were a serious influence on our modern law. Before I do talk about the reasons why the Romans were important, I'd just like to say that I film these videos for interest and not for publicity and not for profit. If you're finding them interesting, or if you think that YouTube should contain more justice, more law, or perhaps just more Romans, then please click the subscribe button. It lets you be notified when I release another video, and it also tells YouTube that more people are interested in these videos and therefore pushes them higher up on other people's lists so that they can see them too. It also gives me a big boost of enthusiasm to know that people are watching, and it's totally free. So, the first thing we can learn from ancient civilization is the argument between natural law and positive law. Cicero was actually a proponent of natural law, and what that means is that he thought there are certain moral principles that guide the lawmakers, and if a lawmaker creates a law that isn't in line with those moral principles, then what the lawmaker has created cannot be law. This might sound like a wafty, airy-fairy argument made by an ancient man 2,000 years ago, but actually it has been applied in English courts quite regularly. I might talk about equity in a different video, but for now I'll just restrict myself to saying that almost always in cases where a public authority in England has exceeded its powers or made a decision that the court thinks is not in accordance with natural justice, the court will override the decision of the public authority, and they'll use natural justice as the reason and the justification for doing this. It's just as important now as it was in Cicero's time. Positive law, by contrast, is where somebody might say that the lawmaker has the authority to make the law, and whether you like it or not, you'll have to go along with it. But it's quite an interesting jurisprudential debate between natural lawyers and positivists, and again, it's too big to discuss here. Therefore, I'll go on to my next point, which is the adversarial method. Now, it might surprise you, given that about 2,000 years have elapsed since Cicero was around, that we still use exactly the same method to reach a conclusion in law as Cicero and his fellow Romans did. In his debates against public figures or private figures in law, Cicero would have had an adversary, such as the formidable Hortensius, who he battled in his case against Verres, the corrupt governor of Sicily. The point in the adversarial process is that you get one great lawyer, such as Cicero, and you match them against another great lawyer, such as Hortensius. Each man tries to come up with all of the arguments he can think of in favour of his side, and this helps to eliminate bias in the judge or the jury by ensuring that they get to hear both arguments equally from hopefully equally skilled public speakers, and they can then make a balanced decision between the two. This is a very ancient concept, but it's exactly the same as what modern barristers do these days. Nothing has changed. The third and final reason why Roman law is just as significant today as it's ever been is precedent. Now, this entire video has really been about precedent, because the way the Romans did things influences the way that we do things today. And that's not because there's anything specific or magical about the Roman Empire or the Roman Republic. It's just the fact that humans tend to learn from history. As I said at the beginning, precedent is history. Judges use previous cases to decide later ones, just as we use history to inform our decisions going forwards. If you don't understand the Romans, that's fine. But even if you don't want to understand the Romans, you will find yourself applying principles that they were grappling with many, many years before you started to grapple with them. Like it or not, precedent is a key part of law.